Hi, my name is Brenda Fuentes, and this is my presentation for Lit 327. My presentation topic was miscegenation laws, interracial relationships, and the Supreme Court case of Loving versus Virginia. Miscegenation laws are laws that enforce racial segregation at the level of marriage and intimate relationships by criminalizing interracial marriage and sometimes also sex between members of different races. These laws were first introduced in North America from the late 17th century onwards by several 13 colonies and United States territories. They remained enforced until 1967. After the Second World War, an increasing number of states repealed their anti-miscegenation laws. In 1967, in Loving versus Virginia, the remaining anti-miscegenation laws were held to be unconstitutional by the United States Supreme Court. Interracial relationships continued to happen regardless of the new laws that were implied. Look at Loving versus Virginia. There is Ruth Williams and Sir Secrets Ham. There's also Louisa and Louis Gregory. To break down the definition of miscegenation is a felony. These laws prohibit the solemnization of weddings between persons of different races and prohibited the officiating of such ceremonies. Sometimes the individuals attempting to marry would not be held guilty for miscegenation itself, but felony charges of adultery and fornication would be brought up against them instead. In 1664, Maryland passes the first British colony law banning marriage between whites and slaves, a law that, among others, orders the enslavement of white women who have married black men. In 1691, the Commonwealth of Virginia bans all interracial marriages, threatening to exile whites who marry people of color in the 17th century. Exile usually functions as a death penalty or death sentence. Between 1780 and 1871, other states like Pennsylvania and Massachusetts repealed the anti-miscegenation laws. Representative Andrew King proposes a United States constitutional amendment banning all relationships between whites and people of color. It wasn't until 1883 in Pace versus Alabama, the United States Supreme Court unanimously rules that the state-level bans on interracial marriage do not violate the 14th Amendment of the United States Constitution. The ruling held for more than 80 years. In 1912, Representative Seaborn Ronnenberg makes a second attempt to revise the United States Constitution in order to ban interracial marriage in all 50 states. In 1964, in McAllen versus Florida, the United States Supreme Court unanimously rules that laws banning interracial sex violate the 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution. In 1967, the Supreme Court unanimously overturns Pace versus Alabama, which happened in 1883, ruling in Loving versus Virginia that state bans on interracial marriage violate the 14th Amendment of the Constitution. In 2000, following a November 7th ballot referendum, Alabama becomes the last state to officially legalize interracial marriage. In the case of Loving versus Virginia, in 1958, two residents of Virginia, Mildred Jeter, a black woman, and Richard Loving, a white man, were married in the District Court of Columbia. The Lovings returned to Virginia shortly thereafter. The couple was then charged with violating the state's anti-miscegenation statute, which banned interracial marriages. The Lovings were found guilty and sentenced to a year in jail. The trial judge agreed to suspend the sentence if the Lovings would leave the state of Virginia and not return for the time period of 25 years. Now, the issue in this case is, did Virginia's anti-miscegenation laws violate the Equal Protections Clause of the 14th Amendment? The court ruled yes. In a unanimous decision, the court held that distinctions drawn according to race were generally odious to a free people and were subject to the most rigid scrutiny. Under the Equal Protection Clause, the Virginia law, the court found, had no legitimate purpose independent of invidious racial discrimination. Basically, the court found that this law or statute was discriminative. Therefore, this case overturned everything that happened before, like Pace versus Alabama, and that's why these laws thereafter were taken off in every state up until the year of 2000, where Alabama became the last state to officially legalize interracial relationships. From what I understand, from what I've learned throughout this topic, I feel like people were always going to be together regardless of what we looked like or where we were from. I understand that this was also going on during segregation, and Martin Luther King had a dream. This was a time where, whites weren't going to school with blacks, they weren't going to the same restaurants, Hispanic people couldn't enter a certain location. And, this case, the case of Loving versus Virginia, really affected the miscegenation laws because it overturned it, It said, listen, your law is discriminating us from being together, and therefore, but regardless, they were already married. There was nothing they could have done, the state could have done to separate them. And that's all I have for this presentation. Thank you very much.